Welcome back. In this video, I'll be covering Learning Objective 7.2 for Chapter 7, covering Attitudes and Attitude Change for PSY 235 Social Psychology. In this part of the chapter, you'll be looking at the relationship between attitudes that you hold and then behaviors that should, theoretically, follow them. So if you like a particular political candidate, the assumption is you will vote for that candidate. What we know, though, is that people, they aren't always rational, and their attitudes and their actions don't always match. You could have lots of positive attitudes towards exercising regularly, but never exercise. So we need to understand what are the conditions under which attitudes can actually predict our actions. So when we start this conversation, we have to go all the way back to the 1930s when a scientist named Richard Lapierre did a study. I won't call it an experiment because it doesn't have that kind of rigor, but he did a study where he took a Chinese couple with him. Now, you have to remember that during the 1930s, there was a great deal of anti-Asian bias during that time period. It was a difficult time in our history, and there was just a tremendous amount of anti-Asian sentiment. During the pandemic, we saw this rise again. That's why I included this image on the slide of protesters, one of whom is apparently Asian, holding up a sign that racism is a virus. Because early in the pandemic, there was this story that was kind of circulating in the atmosphere in the United States that the virus originated in China and therefore Chinese people were problematic. So there were even calls for, chasing people from China out of the country. And it really brought back a lot of memories of this time in the past when our culture had a lot of strong anti-Asian sentiment. So go backwards in time to the 1930s. Lapierre invited a Chinese couple to go on a road trip with him, and he wanted to see whether or not the prejudice against Asian people that was so common in the United States at the time would translate into actual discrimination. So he went to hotels, to campgrounds, to restaurants, whatever. And he wanted to know whether he and his friends would get service or whether they would be refused service. Now, prior to this, he made phone calls. He called establishments that he was going to visit in person and asked the question, do you serve Chinese people at your establishment? So he called restaurants. Will you allow Chinese people to eat at your restaurant? And a lot of these establishments said absolutely not, because there was a tremendous amount of deep anti-Chinese sentiment at that time. What he found, though, was that the vast majority of the places that he went, without question, allowed them to access services in those establishments. So they were never denied rooms, they weren't denied restaurant service. Only once were they actually refused service during their trip. Now, there are reasons why. If the Chinese couple had gone on their own and weren't with Professor Lapierre, who was white, would the same results have been the same? And that's a legitimate question. Follow-up research has suggested that, yes, there would be more refusals, but still, when push comes to shove, proprietors of businesses tend not to want to lose business. It's one thing to say on a survey or respond on a phone call that you're going to behave in a way that rejects certain kinds of people, that blocks them out. But it's another thing entirely when you are face-to-face with people, even if you don't like them, to tell them that you cannot eat in their restaurant. So there was a disconnect there. And what researchers following Lapierre for decades have been able to show is that we often behave in ways that are not consistent with our stated opinions. And that raises a lot of questions, like why do we do that? So the remaining part of this section is to explore that why question. Why is there a disconnect between attitudes and actions so often? The bottom line is that social influence plays a significant role in determining whether or not your attitudes will actually predict what you do. In addition, a whole load of situational factors are going to be in play as well. So first, how well do attitudes predict what are called spontaneous behaviors? So these are behaviors that you have not given thought to. They're just spontaneous situations. Attitudes are only going to be a useful predictor of these kinds of spontaneous actions if those attitudes are made highly front of mind. So they have to be accessible to you cognitively. So if someone reminds you, they drop a nugget in your brain and it makes an attitude accessible, and then you're presented with a situation spontaneously where you could act on those attitudes, you are much more likely to follow through. If, however, that attitude is not highly accessible, it's a toss-up whether or not you will follow your attitude in that context. Remember that attitude accessibility refers to the ease with which you can get to that thought, that attitude in your mind. It's sometimes described, as your authors describe it, the strength of the connection between the attitude object and how you feel about that object, whether you like it or don't like it. And that, then when we try to connect that up with spontaneous behaviors, what researchers will often do is they will assess how quickly people can report how they feel about the object. If they can report about it very, very quickly, then it's highly accessible. If it's highly accessible, it's going to be a strong predictor of your behaviors with respect to that attitude object. If it's not highly accessible, however, your attitudes are going to come to mind more slowly, and you're therefore going to respond much more strongly to situational predictors of your behavior. So you'll be much more vulnerable to social influence in that context. Now, in contrast to spontaneous behaviors, you have deliberative behaviors. So these are behaviors that you think about in advance. You make a decision whether or not you're going to engage in those behaviors. So these aren't just situations where you're bored and you go to the store and a shirt just speaks to you and you decide to buy it. That's a spontaneous behavior. Deliberative behaviors are more like, you have to have a specific outfit to go to a wedding next week. You have in mind what you need to get, and you go to a store and you look for that thing. Those are deliberative behaviors. So some decisions are far more spontaneous. Some decisions are far more carefully considered. When we're looking at these deliberative behaviors, accessibility of attitudes is less important because you have already been deliberating. You've been thinking, okay, what kind of outfit do I need? Do I need a suit? Do I need a dress? Is it business casual or is it formal? We give a lot of consideration to those things. That's really the essence of deliberative behaviors. It's only when we have to decide how to act on the spot, though, that accessibility is critical. Now, the theory that helps us understand the difference between these spontaneous and deliberative behaviors is the theory of planned action or planned behavior. According to this theory, when people have time to think about how they're going to act, the best predictor of their behavior is their intentions in the moment. Not necessarily underlying behaviors or attitudes and feelings, but do they intend to follow through with that behavior? Intention is determined by three things. It's determined by the attitude toward the specific behavior. It's also, though, influenced by subjective norms, which are how your assumptions about other people's beliefs about it's essentially, how do other people care about what you do? And do other people behave in that same way about the topic or the attitude object? And then there's perceived behavioral control. And that is, how easily do you think you can actually perform the behavior? So, for example, if you're thinking about improving your diet and adding lots of fruits and vegetables and maybe cutting out some highly processed foods or whatever, you may have very positive attitudes towards eating in a healthy way, whatever that is. So your attitude may be very positive. On the subjective norm side, your beliefs about how other people that you care about view the behavior matters. So if everybody in your social circle is really intent on eating healthy foods and avoiding certain quote-unquote non-healthy foods, the subjective norm is going to be really strong in support of your attitude that healthy foods are good. Then what about perceived behavioral control? Do you in fact believe that you will have the fortitude, the willpower to avoid your favorite nasty foods, your favorite ice cream, your favorite cookies, your favorite whatever? Do you believe you'll be able to do it? Will you be able to follow through on your intention when you're actually in the grocery store picking out food, or when you're in a restaurant with your friends selecting menu items? What all those three things combine into is behavioral intention. If the intention is backed up by your attitude, the subjective norms, and your perceived behavioral control, you'll actually follow through, and your behavior will be consistent with your underlying attitude. If, however, the subjective norms are not supportive, meaning the people around you don't care about your healthy eating preferences, and they're eating lots of things that go against your attitude, and you don't believe you will have the willpower to follow through, you will not form a strong behavioral intention, and your behavior will not be consistent with your attitude toward healthy food. Now, the theory of planned action or theory of planned behavior holds that the more specific the attitude is, meaning very specific, the stronger the connection between the attitude and specific behaviors. So, for example, if, and I just got home from the grocery store, so I have groceries on my brain. If you are very specific about your attitude towards certain foods, and you go to the grocery store with that specific attitude of purchasing specific kinds of foods like fruits, vegetables, whatever, lean meats, and avoiding certain other foods like chips and cookies, for example. Those are very specific. So if you have very positive attitudes towards fruits and vegetables and very negative attitudes towards chips and cookies, then you have very specific attitudes, and it can be helpful in terms of being predictive. In the study that they described for you in the text, women were asked about birth control attitudes, and then they wanted to look at the correlation between attitudes and actual actions. And the more specific the question, so if you just ask them about birth control in general, the connection between that question, the response to that question, and actual use data, purchase and use data, was very low. If, however, you ask a very specific question, what's your attitude toward using birth control pills in the next 2 years? Then the correlation gets much stronger, meaning that you are much more likely to be able to predict the behavior using that expression of attitude. So the more specific you can be in your query about the specific attitude, the stronger the connection between attitude and action. On the subjective norm front, predicting what people are going to do also means that you have to have some degree of understanding of what the behaviors are in that person's social group. You can ask them highly specific attitudes, but if they're facing a social normative situation, so if you go back to the birth control example, a person could say, yes, I like birth control options, I even like a specific birth control option, and you could say, well, that should predict them using it. Well, what if their entire social group is very anti-birth control? That could be problematic for drawing a connection between the attitude the person holds and their subsequent behavior. So subjective norms are basically, to review, how do other people that this person cares about view the behavior in question? If they are supportive of the behavior, that tends to reinforce the initial attitude and improve your ability to predict behavior. If your social group says, no, that's not how we feel about it, that chips away, and their behaviors can actually be a stronger predictor of the person's behaviors as opposed to their internal beliefs or attitudes that they hold. So these norms can actually override specific behaviors and then deflate your ability to do good prediction. Perceived behavioral control is, especially if you're trying to change your own behavior based on an attitude that you've now formed. When people sit back and reflect on their previous ability to change their behavior, if they find that they have failed repeatedly at being able to change their own behavior, then they will be less likely to form a full-on intention to behave in ways that are consistent with their underlying attitudes. So perceived behavioral control matters a lot, especially if you're trying to enact some change. You're trying to build a new habit, for example. If you're trying to exercise more often, it's very easy to say, yes, I value exercise. Exercise would be good for me. I have positive attitudes towards exercise. Now, that's a pretty broad attitude. If you ask for the specific, do you intend to exercise in the next 2 weeks? Or how often do you intend to exercise in the next 2 weeks? That could be pretty specific. And if you ask about the social norms around the person, do your friends exercise? Do your family members exercise? If the answer is yes, that's a good thing. But if you know that you are highly unlikely to follow through, then your attitudes, your underlying attitudes, are not going to be a particularly useful predictor for you. So anything that makes people think it's easy to do the behavior means that they're likely to follow through. If they think it's going to be super hard, they're likely to fall off the rails and not engage in the behavior. So that concludes my coverage of Learning Objective 7.2. Join me next time for Learning Objective 7.3, which involves explaining how internal and external factors can lead to changes in our attitudes.